Hello, everybody. Thank you all for joining us again on the third and final day of the workshop on earthquake damage mitigation for collections, led by Jerry Podany and McKenzie Lowry. My name is Dunja Vranešević, and I'm a documentation specialist from the Museum Documentation Center in Zagreb. And here with us is also my colleague Sagita Miriam Sunara from the Conservation Restoration Department of the Arts Academy in Split. Hi, Sagita. Sagita and I will be moderating the program. Sagita will now say a few words about our first few days. Sagita, over to you.
Thank you, Dunja, very much for this announcement, and hello, everyone. So this is, as you know, the third day of our workshop on earthquake damage mitigation for collections. And the workshop started with a discussion on the nature of earthquakes. And then we talked about, or Jerry Podany talked about, the process of determining collections' seismic vulnerability. He also tackled the topics of how to evaluate the potential responses of objects to earthquakes. And then today he will talk about vulnerability surveys and post-earthquake documentation. Today he will also be joined by his colleague, a very experienced mount maker, McKenzie Lowry, and Jerry will explain a little later on how this day will be organized, which other topics will be discussed. But Mac will focus on the practical issues that I know many of you in the audience are so very keen to know more about. Dunja?
So we've heard already about Jerry, who is a leading expert in earthquake damage mitigation for collections and an author and editor of the two publications that tackle in depth this extremely important topic. Now I will introduce to you McKenzie Lowry, Jerry's colleague from the J.P. Getty Museum, who will give his lecture today. So, McKenzie Lowry specializes in seismic mount making. He received a Bachelor of Arts in Art Studio at the University of California, Davis in 1985 and a Master of Fine Arts in Painting and Drawing from Washington State University in 1987. In 1997, he joined the Antiquities Conservation staff at the J. Paul Getty Museum, and at his retirement in 2021, he held the title of Senior Mount Maker for the department. In 2007, McKenzie and his colleagues developed the Mount Makers Forum to address the modern concerns of mount making for art objects. The forum has continued to hold meetings since then every 2 years. He has presented numerous papers internationally outlining the Getty's broad approach to mount making for art and artifacts. Sagita, you can continue.
Excellent. Thank you, Dunja. Now, before we ask Jerry to start his presentation, I would like to again remind everyone in the audience that you should turn your microphones off and keep your cameras shut during the presentations, and then you can turn the cameras on during the discussion, of course. As for the discussion, we encourage you to use the chat section to pose questions to our speakers. So as you know, Jerry, he is really a leading expert in seismic damage mitigation to collections. As you could just hear from what Dunja said, Mac has several decades of experience in the practical sides of these matters. So you have really a unique opportunity to ask questions to such wonderful experts who are so generously sharing their knowledge with us. And so please use this opportunity. So you can either post your questions in the chat section, or another option is to wait for the discussion session, and then you can raise your hand and ask the question in person. Please also note that Croatian members of the audience, we have a lot of Croatian colleagues here, that you can, if you are not so confident in your English, you can write your question in Croatian, and then Dunja and I will translate it. Please be also reminded that this whole workshop is being recorded, and that by participating in the workshop, you consent to video recording and to its release on the YouTube channel of the Museum Documentation Center. We will share in the chat section the link to the YouTube channel of the Museum Documentation Center, where in a few days' time, hopefully you will be able to access the recordings of all 3 days. And thank you also to Mac and Jerry for allowing the workshop to be recorded. And so, having given these short technical instructions, again, everybody is encouraged to ask questions in the chat or during the discussion session. session. And so, Jerry, now I invite you to take the floor.
Thank you, Sakita, and thank you, Donya. Let me share the screen. Good. So welcome back. It's a pleasure to be back for the third day, and certainly a pleasure to be joined by my colleague, McKenzie Lowry. Briefly, as Sakita has charged me to do, let's look at what we're going to do today. I'm going to start with a very brief presentation on vulnerability surveys, reviewing how one can estimate the vulnerability of a collection, as well as the non-structural hazards, which we talked about yesterday. And then I'll also briefly review the idea of post-earthquake documentation, which is so important if we're going to advance our efforts in seismic mitigation. Then McKenzie is going to take over, and he's going to look at approaches, methods, and materials for seismic mount making. As Sakita and Donya both said, the practical end of this, and how to apply all of the principles which have flown by you in the last 2.5 days and sessions. Before I start to speak about vulnerability, I was thinking about a comment made yesterday that in most museums, what is in storage is of secondary value compared to what is on display. I think there are several points we might need to consider. What is secondary to some collections might be astonishingly important if it were in another collection. So it's all relative. So it benefits all of us to consider our roles as stewards in material heritage in a larger context. And secondly, by working toward mitigation and storage first, one has, in a sense, already made a value decision. That comment came up in a discussion about how we can prioritize and how we place different values on different things. By starting in storage, we put priority on those objects, but perhaps not for the best reasons. There's a bit of a catch in this situation. After undertaking such an effort, if it's limited to storage, we must guard against the feeling that our work is done for the entire collection, and clearly it's not. There are still those parts of the collection in the galleries. And it is those things that are on public exhibition that are going to be, in fact, a greater challenge. It's where there will be a great potential for conflicts with curators, designers, and even directors because of aesthetic issues. It is there where there'll be the greatest need for compromise. Compromise so that perfect, as the old saying goes, so that perfect doesn't get in the way of good. And as you will see during McKenzie's talk, the effort has to provide protection that is also discreet, or at least not too visually disruptive. It is possible to do that, but it takes creativity, effort, and a bit of practice. So we're going to talk today very briefly, as I said, about vulnerability surveys. It's among the last steps in preparing for earthquake damage mitigation measures, and it's the assessment of the collection's vulnerability. It defines the level of risk that you're taking with respect to the hazard of earthquakes. One way is to look at one way to undertake a vulnerability survey is to look at each object individually and determine what it would require to make it slide, rock, or overturn. You may remember from yesterday's discussion that there were 3 formulae that were presented. One for determining stability, that is, that the object will be fine. The other to determine whether it might slide, and the other to determine if it might overturn, fall over. So let's go back and look at one of the examples from yesterday. Remember, it's a simple diagram of an object attached to a large pedestal. And let's apply, oh, sorry, and the image on your right is the equivalent block, the representation, the simplified representation of the model on your left. And let's apply one of those formulas. The object is stable if the force is less than the mass of the object times gravity multiplied by the base dimension, all divided by the height of the equivalent block multiplied by the coefficient of friction. So let's see what happens if we calculate that. I plugged in all the numbers from our model. And you see that at least in the first phase, we have identified 989.6 newtons. A newton is a way of describing force. And let's say that we've done that by planning for one full G force to occur at the object center of mass. Sorry, let me go back here. So that would result in a force of around 755 newtons. And 755 newtons is less than the 956 newtons that it would take to cause the object to become unstable. So in this case, the object is stable. But there was a second part of that formula you might have noticed, and it's about sliding. If the force is greater than the coefficient of friction multiplied by the mass multiplied by gravity, then the object will slide. So if the force that would be experienced by the object is 755 newtons, we plug in the numbers, and we see that 755 newtons is greater than the 377 newtons, and so the object would in fact slide. I hope you can begin to see how the various principles which we discussed over the last couple of days start to apply. In any case, when we talk about vulnerability surveys, you might begin to categorize your collection in groups of common shapes, in groups of common mass distributions, or in aspect ratios. And if you know the force that you expect, you can get a sense of what they do. Alternatively, you can intuit whether you think an object will overturn in an earthquake and test your intuition on a random sample of representative objects of each type in your collection by calculating their possible response to the earthquake, as we did just a moment ago. Or you might contract or partner with an engineer to develop a stability chart, which we saw yesterday, and plot the aspect ratios to generally predict the responses of the objects. I know that some of you have very large collections, and so it's reasonable to only take a random sampling of the different kinds and shapes of objects, calculate those, and then utilize intuition for the larger number. In addition to determining response modes, the vulnerability survey should include an assessment of the object's fragility, defined as the likelihood of damage due to inherent material characteristics, or alterations to that object due to deterioration, repair, restoration, all of which may have weakened the original fabric. It should also include the fragility of parts that extend from the object and are particularly susceptible to damage. There's very little difference between this information and that contained in a conservation conditions survey. And clearly, all collections should have a condition survey for each object, though vulnerability might get into slightly less detail than the usual form of condition survey. So when we speak of what you should put into a vulnerability survey form, I have provided in the past to Sagita and colleagues a number of different kinds of forms used by different museums around the world. But I think it suffices to say that you should record whether or not the object will be stable, will it rock, will it overturn, or will it slide? How is it exhibited or stored? Is it on a shelf? Is it in a case, on a deck or a shelf in the exhibition case? Is it standing on the floor, hung on the wall? Is it standing on a pedestal? Is it suspended? Is the object anchored or is it restrained? I'm showing you slides of post-earthquake damage to remind you what might happen in these various categories. Is it a single object? Or is it an object assembly? Now, these are the basic core of any kind of vulnerability survey. I don't have a standard form to share with you, but if you cover those issues, then you're bound to understand better how the object might in fact respond, and then you can begin to plan the distribution of resources toward mitigation. And at that point, you might revisit all the information that you gathered previously as to the expected earthquake and adjust for an appropriate risk level. So if the object is on exhibition, you want to make sure you have an object identification. The location, is it in a gallery, a specific location within the building? If you have multiple buildings, which one is it in? Is it on exhibition or is it in storage? Again, is it a single object or a composite, a group of objects, or an assembly? Its general dimensions. You can be very specific, or you can simply say that it's monumental, large, mid-size, or small. The display conditions. Is it on a pedestal, on a shelf, on a platform, on the floor, in an exhibition case, etc.? And the display fixtures. Does it have a mount, a restraint, an anchor? And in post-earthquake surveys, you will then add, how did it fail and why? How did it move? We're now into the area of post-earthquake documentation. How did it move? Did it walk, vibrate? Did it slide? Did it overturn? That is, did it fall? Or did it fall from a higher point? What was the direction of the fall? And generally speaking, what was the damage? Was it slight? Was it moderate? Was it severe? Or was it a complete loss? And how was it damaged? Was it damaged from impact with another object, with a wall, with the floor because it fell? Did it slide into something? And then, of course, always leave room for miscellaneous notes. If you're doing post-earthquake documentation and storage, you once again should have object identification as you did before, its location. Was it on an open shelf? Was it on the floor, in a cabinet, in a box, in a crate, on a rack, perhaps, in a drawer? And you also want to take a moment to look at non-structural collateral hazards. Beyond the idea of a broken pipe or a gas leak, large major issues, you want to look at whether or not your temporary walls in an exhibition, if you had any, survived. Did they move? How about the exhibition cases? Are they still sound? Did they move? The furniture in general around the galleries, the lighting fixtures, did some come down? Did some remain? How about signs, instructional or directional signs, large exhibition panels and posters? Ducting in the ceiling, did it fail? Did it come down? Did doors or windows move or fracture? And other observations you might have. Now, as I said, the survey will depend heavily, this post-earthquake survey will depend heavily on photographic documentation. And as much as possible, the scene should remain undisturbed until you have more time to document the situation more carefully. But it is completely understandable that this may not be possible if the object is in danger. But if the object is not in danger, documenting through photographs the situation you find as you finally enter the building is really quite important to learn lessons from the experience. It isn't very informative to gather up all the pieces, take them to another location, arrange them on a table neatly, and document the damage. That's good for treatment reports, perhaps, but it doesn't tell us anything about the context in which the object was damaged. You want to be sure that you take at least 2 or 3 photos of the entire context. It's kind of like treating the scene, the situation as a crime scene, that you want to document everything as found so that later you can begin to piece together how and why the object was damaged. These are all part of the post-earthquake survey, and I can't emphasize enough how important that kind of documentation is. This is how we learn from the past. This is how we figure out what worked and what didn't work and why, and what we need to do better in the future and what we need to continue to do because it works so well. Documenting those things are important in the sense of, if you look at this collection of clocks, it's odd, isn't it, that only one, at least in this photograph, only one has moved. Why? At the time of post-earthquake documentation, after the photograph is taken, if you have time at that point, you can explore a little bit more. You may find, for example, that it was the only clock with an openable door, or that the door wasn't latched, and that's why you have such an odd singular event. Post-documentation will help you understand better why certain objects fall over, why certain object assemblies have failed. Perhaps all the rest were tied down. Perhaps the object wasn't attached firmly enough to a pedestal. Or perhaps it was that object that had just the right combination of mass distribution to be affected by the primary frequency of the earthquake. And post-documentation will also help us understand how object assemblies fail or don't, and what works to protect them or doesn't. You see here a situation where two of the architectural elements that supported a piece that went over the top have survived quite well because they've been tied back to the wall. But the top element, the arch, if you will, fell from the top either because it wasn't firmly attached or because the attachment wasn't sufficient for its weight. Now, ideally, a basic skeletal outline of both surveys, the vulnerability survey and the post-earthquake documentation form, would be consistent collection to collection throughout your country. Different museums could add information and add places for more detail, but the core information would be there in all of those forms. Why is that beneficial? Well, wouldn't it be good for all museums in the affected area or the affected country to compare their experiences, share challenges, resolve why some objects were damaged, why others were not, all adding up to the ongoing improvements in their effort to protect their collections? Wouldn't it be great if at the end of such a disaster that affects so many institutions, that representatives of those institutions could come together with a common form, a common set of information, and be able to compare notes and be able to help each other develop further advance their efforts to mitigating damage in the future. So I'm advocating for a basic core form that lists much of the information we just saw in the last slides for both evaluating vulnerability and for post-documentation so that we can learn from our successes and from our mistakes. At this point, I'm going to hand over the screen to either Donya or Sigita, who will introduce McKenzie and who will talk about the application of the principles we've discussed so far.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jerry. I will now stop sharing your screen. Excellent. So McKenzie was very kind, but also very prudent to produce a pre-recorded version of his presentation. And because we saw this right before the start of the workshop that we have some technical issues with sharing his presentations, what I will do now is that I will play the pre-recorded version. But Mac is present here with us, and he will later join the discussion in person, and we will also ask him, so after I play his presentation, we will then ask him also to provide some background on mount making in the US. I know from my personal experience that we don't even have in Croatian language the word for mount making. So that tells you a little bit if we have specialists or professionals of such specialization within our heritage and museum community. So it will be quite an interesting topic, I'm sure, and it will raise many questions. So again, I remind everyone in the audience to use the chat section for asking questions. And having said that, I will stop my video and I will start sharing a Mac's presentation in a second.
Hello, my name is McKenzie Lowry. Together with Jerry Podany, I've worked for over 20 years to help protect the collections at the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles. We've also had the honor of exchanging methods and experiences of this work with numerous international colleagues, and it's a pleasure to continue that tradition with you here today. Prioritizing the safe display of cultural artifacts in seismic zones presents numerous challenges, from logistics to aesthetics. For a mount maker such as myself, This primarily consists of ensuring that the methods used for stabilizing displays are effective, but don't create a distracting or unattractive result. I hope that the following slides provide you with a clear look at some of the techniques we've used and developed. A well-equipped workshop is a great asset in the making of mounts, and the following few pictures illustrate specific features that help promote innovation and production in that environment. Visible here are movable workbenches that let us reconfigure the environment to best suit the needs of personnel and objects, adjustable task exhaust trunks that remove fume and particulate, a bridge crane up above that can lift up to 2,700 kilos, a lathe, and a mill for customizing shapes in all kinds of materials, and art storage cabinets that enable us to keep the artifacts close by, yet secure. Here's a look at our welding, brazing, and grinding room, dedicated to the hot and dirty work of cutting, forming, and joining metal. Visible on the right are a chop saw, sandblaster, plasma cutter, and gas welders, as well as task exhaust. Pictured on the left are metal storage racks and a large grinding wheel. I should mention that this room has an independent high-exchange ventilation system. It's capable of handling hot sparks and keeps particulate and fume content to a minimum. Although many diverse materials are used in making mounts, we primarily rely on metal armatures, which offer the most strength while using the least amount of material. Most commonly, we use brass and stainless steel. Custom bending of metal is central to making mounts, and pictured here are some of the different tools we use for smaller-sized metal. The hand benders on the upper right are wonderful for thinner or softer materials like brass. The benchtop bender made by Duomite, pictured in the vise above and on the left, can easily bend stiffer metals such as steel and allows for complex bends in small to medium-sized metal stock. Our approach to stabilizing objects usually proceeds in one of two directions: stationary supportive or decoupling. Stationary supportive mounts represent the vast majority of our efforts and are often concealed behind or within an object so as not to be distracting. We mechanically attach these armatures to the display surface for assured stability and always include a protective layer of soft material such as felt between the object and mount. A decoupling approach allows the object and earth or building to move independently of each other in a designed and measured manner. The mechanism, often called an isolator, acts as a form of horizontal shock absorber to reduce the transference of seismic forces to the object. The version of isolator pictured here was designed by the Getty Museum and has an internal spring system that recenters the three frames and provides a designed amount of resistance to the movement. The use of an isolator reduces the supportive needs of a mount as it reduces the seismic forces transferred to an object. But as seen here, isolators do not eliminate the need for restraint, and small clips are still used around the foot of this vase. As stationary supportive mounts fulfill most of a collection's needs for stabilization, I'll start with methods and materials associated with them. Here are a couple of examples of small metal mounts formed with the handheld and benchtop benders pictured earlier. On the left is a typical mount used for gems and coins. In this design, 3-wire arms are independently fastened to a central disc with countersunk set screws in the back. After being bent to the necessary shape, each arm is coated with a heat shrink plastic tube that's painted to match the object's color. A central threaded hole in the back side of the disc is used to fasten the mount to its display surface. In the middle and right side images is an example of what we commonly refer to as a spider mount. Similar to the coin and gem mount, 3 arms radiate from a central disc on the object's back side. Each arm is bent to conform to the object's shape, with a layer of felt adhered to the stainless steel as a barrier between the mount and object. A threaded central hole on the back of the disc once again provides an attachment point for either a vertical or horizontal post. Both of these examples illustrate how metal mounts can intimately conform to the shape of objects, creating increased stability and less visibility. This example of an internal mount for a small bronze bust uses multiple materials together, taking advantage of their individual properties for the specific needs of the mount. The 4 materials pictured on the lower left represent the most common materials used for fabricating the structural components of a mount: acrylic, aluminum, brass, and steel. In the installation pictures on the top, the main component of the mount is visible on the far left, being inserted into a cavity in the base of the head. This is an acrylic disc fitted with 4 extending bands on its perimeter. The acrylic is beneficial here for the ease with which it can be worked, allowing for relatively quick shaping, drilling, and tapping for screws. Its transparency can also be helpful, allowing one to see through it during the fitting of the mount to the object. The extendable bands around the perimeter are made of brass, which provides sufficient strength in a very thin profile that's fairly easy to bend and solder. The steel screws that hold the bands in place and centrally fasten the mount provide the greatest strength at a size small enough to fit in this confined space. Finishing off the mount at the far right is an aluminum spacer, providing a rigid material that machines easily. Working together, these components make up a mount that assembles inside the base of the object. Since the opening of the object's base is a smaller diameter than the cavity's interior, when the mount is assembled and extended, it becomes trapped in the base, and thus provides a means to restrain the piece, both horizontally and vertically, when it's fastened to its display surface. Here's another example of those same materials in use. Image A shows the finished presentation on the gallery wall. Image B shows the backside of the object with the mount attached. Image C shows the steel support rod and its wall receiver. This type of receiver was developed at the Getty Museum and is used to achieve a mechanical lock on mount posts. Looking closer at the mount and following the arrow from the letter D, you can see that resin putty was cast between the acrylic panel and the object. This set the desired orientation of the fragment and created an even contact between the flat acrylic and curved fragment. We refer to these castings as interfaces. They're cast using plastic film between the resin and object, adhering the cast to the mount, not the object. Since the object is not heavy, brass flat stock was used for the retaining and support clips visible at the letter E. The brass, when annealed, is easy to shape into complex angles. The clips, when finished, are mechanically attached to the acrylic. When complete, all the mount components are sanded and painted a sympathetic color. Inert foam is also an excellent material for mount fabrication. Typically, it's used in conjunction with other materials that provide key areas of strength. Pictured here are two examples of foam being used to stabilize vases that have holes in their bottoms. Both of these mounts consist of multi-part components that get assembled inside the object to provide internal restraint that is not visible when the object's on display. In these configurations, the foam is fairly easy to shape to the inner contour of the vessels, but is finalized with metal hardware to hold and secure the assemblies together. The use of resins is common in our mounts, but its primary use is for forming, not adhering. There are a number of resins available that have been tested and found to be inert once cured. Pictured here are a few of the products that are commonly used. No matter what the brand is, the different viscosities available can be easily incorporated into mount designs and provide conformal fits that would be difficult to achieve otherwise. Pictured on the upper left is a resin in liquid form, useful when a flow is desired to pour into small spaces. The paste version beneath it is viscous enough to not flow, but soft enough to make impressions without having to push too hard. The putty versions on the right, top and bottom, are beneficial when larger amounts of resin are needed or when working into areas where the resin needs to have a greater resistance to gravity. Resin is used in this example to create an interface between the irregular bottom of a sculpture and its display surface. This helps avoid point loading on uneven surfaces and greatly improves stability. Resin interfaces can be easily cut, sanded, painted, drilled, and tapped. Visible on the left, thin plastic film is used as a barrier to prevent the resin from adhering to either the object or the surface upon which it's cast. We typically use 2 to 3 layers of this film when doing this, depending on how rough the surface of the object is. On the right is an example of a finished interface, held back slightly from the perimeter of the object itself and painted to match the color of the display. The 4 mount examples shown here represent our standard stationary supportive designs. From the left, contour mounts are best for tall objects with high centers of gravity. Clips are common with objects having lower centers of gravity. Heavy objects with existing holes are prime candidates for adhered anchors, and hollow objects can often be fitted with interlocking internal mounts. All of these approaches are designed to hold an object securely in place, both vertically and horizontally. In order to increase stability and reduce visibility, all of these methods employ mechanical fasteners that penetrate the display surface. Typically, this is achieved by having a threaded hole in the bottom of the mount. Although this is very effective and less visible, this method does require drilling holes in the display surface and having access underneath or inside the display. Here's a detailed look at that internal mount. This is another good example of foam playing a key role in mount design. The main element on the left is inserted first, followed by an additional section that fits intimately against the opposite wall inside the neck cavity. When these 2 opposing sides are spread apart against the inside of the neck, they lock in place and prevent any pullout. The black oval disc that's visible in the 3rd slide from the left screws into the two opposing sections of foam in the neck, keeping them apart. The oval disc also provides a rigid surface to attach a threaded post, which can be mechanically fastened to the display surface. Here are some detailed pictures of our standard clip design. Visible on the left is a clip with its fastening hardware, all made out of stainless steel, which is advantageous when trying to gain the greatest strength in the smallest size possible. At center, the bottom of the clip is visible with its threaded hole and 3 marks to identify its position around the object. We typically use 3 clips around the bottom of round bases, spacing them 120 degrees apart. On the right is the clip installed with the object. The felt barrier applied between it and the stone is slightly visible at its base. Here are some detailed images of our most common mount, which closely follows the contour of an object's profile. This design provides restraint and support from bottom to top, at which point it's tied off to the object with monofilament, visible on the left. The image on the right illustrates the mechanical fastening of the contour mount to its display block, and the fastening of that block to the surface it rests on. Here are examples of our typical exhibition furniture. It's important to note that no matter what shape the furniture is, it all has removable panels to provide access. This not only allows us to fasten the mounts invisibly, but allows us to mechanically attach the furniture to the gallery walls or floors, both of which are outfitted with threaded attachment points. On the lower left, you can see how the floor attachments are concealed within the design of the terrazzo. The square section that covers this area is removed with a suction cup when access is needed. On the lower right, you can see that the furniture is bolted to this location, and security wiring is available through this point as well. These pictures show what's behind the finished surface of the Getty Villa gallery walls. Threaded attachment locations in a steel armature at regular intervals. This allows even the heaviest of objects to be safely wall-mounted, provided, of course, that they have the proper mount. Although this amount of structure is likely not possible in most museums, it's a good example of foresight during construction and could likely be achieved using simpler methods. This is an example of one of our typical wall mounts for a marble relief. Using existing holes in the marble's back side, we built a cleat system that mechanically captures the stone. Once the mount is bolted to the wall and the object is loaded, the 2 cleats on the back of the stone, shown here on the lower right with the letter A, inset between the cleat blocks on the mount, visible on the left with the letter B. For final fastening, 2 bolts, such as seen with the letter C, join the cleats to the blocks and connect the stone to the mount. The bottom shelf and side edges of the mount are interfaced with epoxy putty to fit intimately with the stone. The finished result is visible on the upper right. When an object has a substantial base that curators consider not visibly crucial to its display, one option to capture the piece is to embed a portion of it under a small amount of compression. This method has 2 distinct benefits. It distributes any potential forces from a seismic event to a broad area of the object's base and avoids a visibly distracting mount. Note that the compression plates visible on the lower right are interfaced with epoxy putty, locking into small cavities in the stone for extra grip. No matter what mount method might be used, we've found it invaluable over the years to thoroughly document our mounts. And here are a few examples of typical approaches to that. On the left is an example of what happens during busy periods with tight deadlines and a lot of work. All pictures and no text. Although we prefer the other two examples pictured here, even documents like that on the left are a great help when the person removing an object from display is not familiar with the mount, or when an object is being loaned and a borrower needs to know how best to provide for its needs. Naturally, in electronic format, these are very easy to store, catalog, and share. The main challenge is finding the time to make them. In the face of a tremendous earthquake, most objects show some fragility, but certain objects are more susceptible than others. I'd like to thank the institution that provided these images, and although they would prefer to remain anonymous, there's much to be learned from these unfortunate events, and we're all better off to be able to share this. This example provides an introduction to the benefits of decoupling, or base isolation. These images define the profound difference between a display mount and a seismic mount. The lack of a vertical restraint to the furniture and the high center of gravity of the statue led to this disaster. From the documentation available, the wall behind the piece was seriously dented, indicating that the piece underwent sustained rocking prior to its fall. Since 1994, this statue has undergone extensive treatment and reconstruction. Its present mount is firmly fastened to its pedestal. It captures the figure in 360 degrees and includes a base isolator that decouples the object from any motions of the building. The use of base isolation to decouple objects from their environment does require extensive research, and understanding the scope of seismic threat to a specific location is always necessary when pursuing these methods. In the early 1980s, the Getty Museum contracted the engineering firm of Linval, Richter and Associates to conduct a seismic survey of the Getty Villa, pictured here. The survey took into account the villa's proximity to local fault zones, the soil composition underneath the building, and the structure of the building itself. Factoring in all of that information, they provided the Getty with a design earthquake that could simulate the worst-case scenario event at the villa, estimated to have a likely peak acceleration of 0.7 Gs. The map on the lower left illustrates the Getty Villa's proximity to our most prominent local faults, those being the San Andreas, about 40 miles to the east, and the Santa Monica Malibu Fault, about 2 miles west on the ocean floor. After many years of experimentation and scientific consultation, the Getty Museum decided to pursue a museum-specific base isolator design. The museum staff, in consultation with local engineers, developed a new 3-level isolator design capable of horizontal movement in 360 degrees. This is a design consisting of 3 steel frames, connected with mechanically attached bearing blocks and guide rails. A series of springs provides a restoring and modulating force to ensure a proper response. Visible here, on top of a computer-controlled shake table, is one of our current base isolators. The bottom frame is bolted to the shake table, and the middle and top frames move independently in X and Y axes. In a minute, we'll run this video to illustrate its properties. The movement that you'll see at the bottom level of the isolator represents our design earthquake, with a peak acceleration of about 0.7 Gs. Once the video begins, please notice the difference between the isolator's bottom level and its top, as this represents how the isolator filters out an earthquake's most destructive forces. Lastly, although we always provide mounts for our isolated objects, for the purposes of this demonstration, this plaster cast has no mount and is free to move.
2, 3.
In this video, the 3 steel frames of the isolator have been fixed together to prevent any movement. This gives you an idea of what would happen with the same event without base isolation. I suppose the video speaks for itself, but I should mention that this setup was made purely to illustrate the substantial benefits of base isolation. In reality, we would never leave any object without restraint, even if it were on an isolator. I hope that this presentation has been informative, and that you're able to take away something useful from it. Thank you for your kind attention.
Okay, so I think that we can resume our session. Dunja, you can turn your camera on. Mac has already turned his camera on. Thank you very much. Jerry, you can do that as well. We shall, however, start with Mac. And Mac, maybe if you can explain to our audience a little bit about mount making in the US.
Sure. It's not a widespread profession, and even by referring to it as profession, I'm stretching what it actually is. As you mentioned in the initial introduction, my background is in fine arts, but I never went to an institute or a school to learn mount making. It was all learned through working at museums, which I was doing in conjunction with teaching once I finished my education. We still have very few resources in the United States for instructing people on how to make mounts. There have been a couple of programs, one based out of Chicago. The Art Institute there in a summer program occasionally offers some instruction, and a private company called Benchmark out of Maryland occasionally offers some instruction as well, though that company is now transitioning as its owners are retiring. So the support system necessary to perpetuate these techniques is not firmly in place. And we are doing everything we can to try to create sustainability, to make sure that
all of the work that's been done for decades now is able to be transferred on and learned by other people and improved on as well. It's a continuing effort, but it's been a challenge to try and encourage conservation programs, probably more than any other, to incorporate these principles and techniques and try to get that instruction blended in to the curriculum of these programs. We've been able to do that to a small degree at the Kotzen Institute of UCLA on the campus at the Getty Villa, but it's not part of the formal curriculum yet. That remains a challenge.
Yeah, and I know, Mac, that you, have devoted a lot of effort into disseminating information about your work and also networking, not just within the US, but internationally. Can you maybe say a few words about the International Mount Makers Forum? And Dunja can bring up the website and maybe you can guide us through it and explain a bit about the concept and the contents of the website.
Sure. Following the first seismic symposium that Jerry created in 2006, my colleagues at the Getty and I, who specialize in mount making, thought it might be a good idea to do something similar that was primarily focused on providing a forum for mount makers nationally at that point in the United States. So starting from zero, we got on the telephone and started calling every museum we could think of, asking if they had a mount maker on staff, and seeing if they would be interested in attending a symposium, a conference on mount making. So it took a couple of years, but in 2008, we hosted the first Mount Makers Forum at the Getty Villa in Los Angeles. And we were pleased that we got a little over 100 participants for that. What you're seeing on the screen now is the home page of a website that we've fairly recently created. This came about 3 years ago after one of our conferences in London. This website is supported by the Departments of Antiquities Conservation and Decorative Arts and Sculpture Conservation at the Getty. They pay the basic fees associated with the website, but it's run and it's updated and maintained by an ad hoc committee, a group of people who volunteer their time. That's an international collaboration, primarily from people in England, Canada, and the United States, but that collaboration continues to grow. So please take note of the website here. It's at mountmakersforum.net. It's accessible to all and is probably the best resource that I could recommend for a wide variety of support in this area. We can go to the next slide, the online forum, and scroll down a little bit, and you can see the various topics that are addressed here, from tips and solutions, job opportunities, and tools and materials. These are being updated on a fairly regular basis, and you can see people's input on a wide variety of subjects, as well as examples of mounts for various objects. Then under conferences, you can scroll down a little bit. We have archived all of the conferences that were held from 2008 onward. You can see we've been all around from London to Washington, DC, and all of the presentations are archived and available free of charge to view. And you can pick from any of them. Then publications is also available. This includes the 2 books that Jerry has put out, as well as you can see magnetic mounting systems, costume design, and basic tooling is also available, as well as metalsmithing, how to work with metals. So our group of volunteers is constantly trying to update these lists and keep them relevant and add new material as it comes. As has been mentioned before, there are very few books dedicated specifically to this area, but that is changing for the better, and we add them as we find them. Workshops and seminars is something new for us. You can see the mini workshop here by Tim Scornia is something that just came out this year. He gives you a step-by-step demonstration on the basic techniques of brazing, primarily with brass and solder. And these are fantastic for introductions into these basic techniques that many people might not be familiar with. And he's volunteered his time and expertise to share this with you. And I think the goal is to continue to provide demonstrations such as this in other varying topics. It takes a lot of effort on the part of the people who do this, because they don't get paid to do this and they have to use their private time to make this happen. But we have tremendous volunteers who are bending over backwards to really flush out this website. And I must say, just in the past couple of years here during the COVID pandemic, we've had an increase in interest and participation, and our group has grown sizably. Materials is another category. You can see from the basic metals, scrolling on down through brass and steel and aluminum, plastic and resins, some of the things that I covered in my talk, barriers and padding, and different types of approaches to this. I think there's suppliers listed for basic materials. So there's all kinds of links in there for resources that should be available internationally, and some descriptions as to how one might use these materials. Tools and equipment, wonderful illustrations on some basic bending tools that are commonly used and available on a wide scale, as well as more specific power tools that are used, and basic soldering and welding in addition. So it's a tremendous resource, and we do encourage you, if you go back to the home screen for a moment, you can see down at the bottom there, the last paragraph, we really do encourage folks to join the IMF and participate as best they can. But even just getting on the website and seeing what's new, occasionally you can learn a lot. And these forums are held on a every other year basis. So the last mount making forum was hosted at the Smithsonian once again last year during the pandemic. And it turned out, because of the pandemic, to be an online event. There was no physical interaction, and that was a first. We had never done that before through any of the past conferences, but it was very successful. And what's relevant, I think, about that is that the Getty will host the next mount making forum next year in November. So about a year from now, a little less. And one of the goals is to not only host an in-person event at the Getty Center in LA, but to have a complement of an online event simultaneously at the same time. So if you're not able to fly to Los Angeles and participate in person. You should still be able to get online and enjoy or participate in some aspect of that forum, which will be held over 3 days' time in Los Angeles. So that's going to take quite a bit of effort to do both at the same time. And I hope we have the staff to do it. I think we will. We certainly have the dedicated interest in making that happen. But watch this website if you're interested in that, and I certainly hope you are, because the number and variety of presentations that they'll have will be tremendous. And this is the best resource we have. So getting back to the term sustainability, this is where we've ended up. We're sort of the odd child out in the conservation world. And we've been able to create a toehold here where we can build a community and share the knowledge that we have.
Thank you so much for presenting this website, which is truly a fantastic resource. We will share in the chat section a link to it. We look forward to being able to follow the new edition of the forum from our corner of the world. It is really a fantastic project, and I can only imagine how much enthusiasm has to be and a lot of free time put into creating things like this. It is greatly appreciated, and I'm glad that we could use also this workshop as an opportunity to promote it, but also to kind of shed a bit more light on your, I will dare to call it a profession or a field of specialty. So we do have now we can slowly start with our discussion, and I will ask Dunja. She has been keeping an eye on the chat section. Dunja, if you can read some of the questions, and then at some point we will also invite some of the colleagues or some of our participants to join us live and to share some of their experiences from the last year's earthquakes, but also to talk a little bit about the efforts that they are now investing, hopefully, into mitigating similar damage in the future. So Dunja, over to you.
Let me first say to McKenzie that I saw you have a great YouTube channel, of course, on Mountmaker Forum, and excellent useful clips on your channel. And for the questions, we have 2 questions from Veljko Đikić from Belgrade. First one, what would be the toughest type of object you had to stabilize? And what about glass objects when it's more difficult to make the mounts less intrusive?
I missed the first part of the question. I'm sorry.
Okay, first question. What would be the toughest type of object you had to stabilize?
The toughest type of object?
Yes.
Usually the largest challenge for us is when objects are shown in the round, when you can walk around an object and see it from every side. So regardless of whether it's a sculpture or a ceramic, there's no opportunity to really hide the mount and not be in the way. These are typically very prominent pieces that get shown in the round like that, usually the best pieces in a collection. So the curators are very interested in keeping the mount to a minimum, and we have to work with them in order to not make the mount so distracting that it disturbs the view of the piece. Glass can be some of the most challenging and toughest to mount as well. I know that was the second question. Because of its transparency, naturally you can see right through it to a mount. We do try to keep those mounts to a minimum and using wire that's coated with a plastic tube, such as I showed in the demonstration or the presentation, can be a good option there as well. With small glass pieces that have a stable exterior, and in antiquities that can be very rare. We do occasionally use museum wax. Now that has to be taken with a lot of caution, because anytime you put wax on an object, you have a few factors to contend with. All waxes have oil included in the base of the wax, which can leach into an object's surface. That oil can transfer, which obviously would be a horrible thing. Also, when you go to remove an object that's been waxed down, the most common approach is to twist the object or run some monofilament line underneath it. And in the process of doing that, you can create stress on the surface of the glass. So glass that's in very good condition and has no delamination or problems with its surface can be an excellent option because it's not very visible. But the factors I mentioned with vulnerabilities have to play a central role in that decision.
Yes, and about the glass, our director Maja Kocijan also added, she said, adding to Veljko's question, in Zagreb museums, glass pieces were damaged badly, even those that were fixed by museum gel.
Yes, wax is not an optimum solution. It holds to a point, but if the object's too big, if the center of gravity is too high, it'll overcome the resistance of the wax. In that case, you would need a metal armature would be best.
Thank you. And
could I just
course.
add something to that? It depends also on the kind of wax or gel you were using. There are a number of products that are available in the United States and I believe in Europe that are a gel. And if you want to run an experiment with how effective that might be, just ball up a piece of that and put it down on a surface and come back in a few hours. And what you have is just a puddle. It flows and it's not a good material to use. It doesn't have sufficient hold on the object. So if you use that material, which Mac I think is still called museum gel or something like that, it flows and it isn't suitable for mounting objects, small glass objects, for example. The museum wax is a little bit better, and just using straight paraffin wax that you warm a little bit in your hands is an improvement on that. But you also, as Mac I'm sure would agree, you also have to be careful of how much you put on. There has to be a sufficient amount that it provides enough strength. But I think Mac has hit on the biggest caution. If the substrate you're putting it on or the object that you've attached it to is porous, you will get some migration and staining. So often what Mac and his colleagues will do is coat that area where the wax will make contact with a little bit of acrylic, like B72 or B48N or whatever, as a protective barrier. And that helps with both the removal and the migration into the porous object.
Thank you, Jerry. Maya also has a question, how about stemware? Glass objects with long and thin stems.
For those, I would recommend a contour mount. So you might recall, we recommend those for the taller objects like stemware would be, where your base to height ratio, as Jerry talked about, is exceeding the grounds of stability. So we would typically run a steel contour up one side of that glass. And it's unfortunate if the glass is clear, the mount will be visible through it, but it's better than losing your object.
Of course, yes. And I have a question about putting a weight in a vase, for example, like pouch or something. What about that?
Yes, it's a viable option. It wasn't mentioned in the presentation. It has limits. So anytime you're adding weight to something, you're hoping that you're lowering the center of gravity. And many times you can do that. And it will help the stability of the object. It won't necessarily restrict it from moving. So lowering the center of gravity, you're going to be decreasing the chance that the object will rock or fall over, but it could move around and maybe make contact with another object. We have used it for temporary displays. It's not something that we recommend for permanent displays because it's not a fail-safe method. It makes things better, but it doesn't give you quite the protection that a physical restraint can provide.
Yeah,
And
thank you.
one should also keep in mind that you want to be sure that the object itself is strong enough to support that kind of internal weight. And as you remember from yesterday, there is a point where you're doing more harm than good when you're making the object, in fact, less stable because you're adding more and more weight. And at a certain point, the center of gravity actually starts going up. So as Max said, it's helpful, but there's a lot of precautions you have to keep in mind.
Thank you.
Both. Yeah, well, I have a question, and I see that there are questions coming up on this topic also in our chat section. So regarding the base isolator, the video demonstration was very, very impressive. And so probably a lot of institutions in Croatia, and in other parts of the world, maybe the first instinct would be, okay, this is something that we need to produce to protect our own sculptures or other types of objects. But what would you say to that? So, and it is on the high end when we look at the cost. It's not a low budget solution. There is also a question about the pricing. We will come to that. But what would you say to that? Should that be like, okay, so this is a cure-it-all? Is that a solution that will work in any case, in any institution, in any part of the world?
It could, but I would not recommend that people focus on that pursuit unless they have a huge amount of money. It's unfortunate that it is as expensive as it is, but these are not mechanisms that you can buy off the shelf. You can't walk into a store and buy one, and there's no competition in the manufacturer to keep the price down. So they are expensive, and they do require, as was mentioned, quite a bit of study in order to understand what the specific threat that you face is in your location. Without that study up front, you're sort of working in the dark, and that's not a good idea. So my recommendation would be for people to focus on the more practical, simpler approaches to their most vulnerable objects. And if base isolation can be afforded, then certainly I would encourage them to start working on a knowledge base, a database that they can start building and refer to better understand the threats and possibly work towards base isolation in the future. But it takes a long time to do that, and it obviously costs a lot of money. I think it's much more practical for people to work on stationary supportive mounts and different approaches to that.
Thank you, Mac. We have another question from our colleague Veljko Džikić. His question is, just as a reference, what would be the production price of the separator isolator that you showed in your video at the end of the presentation? Price-wise, a rough estimate.
Jerry and I have been working with a private client recently who was interested in pursuing base isolation, and he happens to be very wealthy. So we're doing that with him, and we've been working on this for, Jerry, now, 6 months or more. Just to show you how much effort it requires, and it requires a lot of patience on the part of the owner in this case, which he does have. He has patience as well as money. $25,000 was what came in. I was a bit surprised. In the past, it has not been that expensive, but because of the pandemic, all the prices have gone up for raw materials such as steel. I should mention that these isolators, these 3 frames that all move independently, are all made out of steel. The middle frame is 2 inches thick and has to be cut out. So the machining process is extensive, and that I wish I had a calculator so I could tell you in metric terms what this was, but the isolator we're having made is 30 inches square. It's about a meter square, and that's $25,000, which was sort of unfortunate to see. I think Jerry and I were both surprised by that, and a little bit disappointed, not because the client would have trouble paying that, but that these costs are going up. And I wouldn't have expected that isolator to have cost more than $15,000 in years past. But because of the pandemic and other factors, materials and labor, this is where we are.
I want to add another caution to what Mac is saying. There are a couple of companies internationally, one coming out from Japan, and I think they have a field office in Germany, that are offering base isolators for objects, small versions of a entirely different kind of design, although the principle is the same, that you decouple the object from the ground. These are equally expensive, but they are, I have to say, they're not very well made. They're not very well conceived, but they have great PR. They have a great PR sales pitch. So they have a woman sitting with a glass of wine on top of the isolator on a shake table, and she's sitting there and the wine doesn't move at all right. It's very impressive. Right? But these isolators are not, as Max said, off-the-shelf items where one fits every situation. They have to be carefully tuned to the expected earthquake and the characteristics of the expected earthquake. So I feel it's rather irresponsible of this company to put this out there and say, you don't even have to connect the object to the isolator. You can just put it on top and everything will be fine. This is not true, right? So one has to be very careful and buyer beware, especially if you're paying that amount of money. But as Max said, it's an expensive undertaking. On the other hand, just to play devil's advocate, the cost, let's say you have a very rare statue. Let's say you have a Bernini. I mean, what's the cost of that Bernini when it's in one piece versus what's the cost of restoration of that Bernini if it falls over and breaks? So Mac and I both try very hard to be very pragmatic in these workshops and encourage you to pursue the lower cost, common sense, kind of simple approaches. But there are these other exotic and more expensive ones. And if I could also add something to what Mac was alluding to, mount makers are always apologizing for the presence of their mount. And I don't think they should be. A good mount maker will always make, as Mac does, will always make mounts that are as discreet as possible, but still do their job. I think curators and designers and even directors have to start considering some compromises if they want to keep their collections safe. And those compromises might include that you have a mount coming up the back of a glass piece. The mount maker has made it as thin as safely possible. Perhaps they've painted at the back, the color of the back wall, so it disappears. Hopefully they haven't made it out of plexiglass, because we see lots of mounts made out of acrylic plexiglass. That material isn't terribly strong, and you have to be very cautious with using it. But the good mount maker will make it out of material that's sufficiently strong in a design that helps protect the object, and yet tries very hard to be discreet, but it will always be present. And I think it's time for the designers and the curators to start considering this long-term preservation and stewardship of their collection against damage, and you know, meeting us halfway and making some compromises.
Thank you for that comment, Jerry. Before I pass it over to Dunja, because I see that she wants to add something, I actually wanted to ask you if you can. So, from your many years of experience working at the Getty, both you and Matt, can you walk us through what this division of work looks like when you have an object? So, what amount has to be designed, the object has to be displayed. How is the work divided between the designer of the case of the exhibition area, the conservator, and the mount maker?
Well, let me just start that discussion with saying that the Getty Museum has been rather unique in that I insisted that the mount makers be part of the conservation department. Very often in other museums, they're part of design and display, or they're part of art handlers, or they're part of preparations, or they're just some guy that woman gets hired. You know, they don't really have a standing or a status. And I felt very strongly that they needed to be in conservation because they come in intimate contact with the object, and they are perhaps the best example I know of what the conservation profession now likes to call preventative conservation. I think that term's a little misleading, but you know, preventive conservation is conservation, right? But they are at the forefront of protecting the object from disasters. So they need to be intimately connected to the issues, the ethics, and the guidelines of conservation and preservation. So when an object comes in and it's going on display, the first thing, of course, is to do the condition report and to establish material characteristics as best we can, to establish how robust the object is, how fragile the surface might be. And then it goes to the mount maker with a discussion with the conservator about how fragile it is and where areas that shouldn't be touched. And then, Mac, it's up to you.
Right. At that point, we would hope to be participating in the meetings that the designers and curators have to decide how that object is displayed. And as Jerry pointed out, if the mount maker isn't brought into that discussion early on, they're not able to participate in the decisions being made. And it's too often the case the mount maker is brought in at the very end and told, make a mount to display it like this. When if the mount maker had been involved earlier, some compromises could have been reached that might put the object in a better light, might make the object more presentable. So we would typically, after the meetings Jerry described with the conservators and taking account of their evaluation, we would sit down with designers and curators and start mocking up the display. And the mount makers would provide options for what the mount might be after their conversation with the conservator, so that the designers and curators could decide what type of compromises they might be willing to accept. And those discussions would go on, probably turn into illustrations, and sometimes physical mock-ups, so that people can see what the appearance would be.
Thank you so much for this. And the reason I was asking is that on Monday when we started, I did mention that there are several major museums in Zagreb with very big collections who have been emptied out in preparation for the retrofitting of the buildings. And now already they are, the staff is sitting down and starting to plan probably, hopefully, the future new exhibition rooms and also storage areas. And I think that it would be, I feel now, having heard what you said, very important that also conservators and if there are mount makers or at least some technical staff, that they are brought also to the table and involved in this discussion alongside with curators and exhibition designers. I think it would be, I feel at least that it would be immensely important. Jerry, did you want to say something? If not, then Dunja can take over.
No, please go ahead.
I just wanted to say regarding to Jerry's comment that it all comes back to priorities. When you said Bernini, so Louvre would have to do it for Mona Lisa, for example, but it doesn't mean you need to do it for every object if you don't have the money to do it. So maybe you decide this is important more than something else. Yes.
If I can just add something to that, Dunja, I will take the liberty to make something that's my personal standpoint and attitude, that too often do we see that there is some money, and then all the money there is, even if it's not that much money, is allocated to just one object, and then a maximum thing is done on one particular object. Whereas an opportunity, passes by to allocate that money to do something to stabilize the condition of a larger number of items. So my personal standpoint, or what I would advocate for, is that if there are some funds, whatever these funds might be, they can be, we could also talk about people's time, like work hours or whatever, to try to encompass a larger number of objects, not to do everything on just one object, but rather to spread it out on a larger number of items within a collection, if it's doable. That's an approach that I have when collections are in question. So Mac and Jerry, you can comment on it, oppose if you will.
Of course, I think low-cost solutions, but not maybe base isolations for everything if we don't have the money. Yeah.
Right. No, it's a wonderful point. And you mentioned that you have several institutions that have been emptied out and are in the process of redesigning their gallery spaces and their displays. So this is an excellent time to address issues such as we're discussing. I think one of the things that does get discussed in the design meetings that we were talking about just a little while ago is the nature of the display furniture, which we have been talking about quite a bit. And yesterday there were some discussions about glass cases and glass shelves. When we do start laying out designs of displays, furniture is always part of that conversation, and the mount makers are able to bring in options for stabilizing objects that incorporate the furniture. You might recall from my presentation, there was a large stone statue that had a fairly large base underneath it, which got embedded in the furniture, and then it was covered over because the curators, decided the base wasn't important for the view of the object. But the mount maker who worked on that project was integral to that design and told them, if I can do this, I can avoid running a big armature up the backside of the object. It was shown in the round. And so they worked together on that. Getting back to glass, I might say, I think the question came up yesterday, should we use it? I'll tell you, I don't think you should. And I think Jerry mentioned that, anybody who is redesigning gallery furniture should try to avoid using glass display surfaces. And not only because of the images we saw of these shelves breaking and falling down on objects, but from a mount maker's point of view, if I wanted to put clips around a vase, I can't drill through the glass. It leaves us very few options for stabilizing the objects and the mounts. I mean, other than wax or double stick tape, which is occasionally used, a mount maker's hands are tied. They're not able to have the same resources. So furniture is crucial to the display of these objects, and not only the material used, such as glass or wood or acrylic, but the access that was mentioned as well. If you're going to conceal the hardware that attaches these mounts to the display surface, most often you're going to need to get under and inside those cases. So that's really worth paying attention to. I should mention that we don't use, or at the Getty Museum, we don't use glass anymore for display surfaces. You might see it here or there, but it's an old display. For the reasons we've been discussing, it's no longer used in that way. And what we typically use is very thick acrylic sheet. So this is a plastic sheet, commonly called perspex or plexiglass. Usually for a display surface, we would be looking at a thickness of maybe 1.5 to 2 centimeters thick. Very strong. It's inert. You can paint it, and you can drill holes in it and physically fasten it in the display case.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that comment. Dunja, will you take over the questions from the chat section?
Okay, you've talked about plexiglass, but Veljko also asks, how about shaping the plexiglass instead of steel? Is it feasible?
I'm not sure if Veljko was still referring with that question to the base isolator. So Veljko, if you are here, maybe if you can clarify what you meant by this, or maybe the question has been answered, Veljko, if you are present. Yeah, thank you.
Contour holders.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, when I first started at the Getty Museum, we were making contour mounts out of acrylic, out of plexiglass. And it can be shaped. You can cut it, you can sand it, smooth it, paint it. One of the things that we found in our testing on shake tables is that the acrylic is not terribly strong, and it needs to be quite thick in order to achieve the strength necessary for taller objects. But I think the biggest drawback to using acrylic for contour mounts is sometimes, in addition to a central spine, you might want to have arms coming off of the contour mount to hold the sides of an object. When you use acrylic, you use what's called an acrylic glue, which joins these pieces of acrylic together. It's actually a solvent that starts breaking down the acrylic, and it becomes somewhat liquid and then attaches itself. Those glue joints are very weak. So we used to make acrylic mounts that had numerous glue joints so we could branch off of the main element and secure other parts of the object. But we found these glue joints to be very weak, and anytime you get extended shaking, the joints just pop and fall apart. So we don't really do, we might do it as I showed. It doesn't mean that acrylic is not useful. And I think there were at least 2 examples in the presentation of acrylic being used in conjunction with other materials. So it plays a good role in making mounts, but not necessarily for contour mounts.
Thank you, Mac. We have another question from Thea Richter-Juric. She is from the Museum Documentation Center. She says, what about the hanging objects or installations, mostly contemporary, that were made out of different materials with different centers of gravity, and their connection points may be weak points? In those cases, might be difficult to hide the reinforcements.
These are for objects that are suspended. We don't do that at the Getty. It's very rare that an object would be suspended. And if we do, it's got a rigid armature that's integrated into that suspension system. So
Occasionally, you'll see objects on display that are hanging from wire or monofilament, but that does not provide enough restraint under earthquake conditions. So if we display an object to look like it's suspended, it's a little bit of an illusion. We always have some type of rigid, stiff armature that is probably concealed within the object to try and stabilize that object so that it doesn't start swinging like a pendulum. We would never leave an object hanging without a rigid restraint. It'll become a pendulum and smash into something or fall apart.
But in those situations where you really have no choice, like for example, a chandelier, or if there's a contemporary piece, in the United States, we have an artist by the name of Chihuly who uses blown glass, and often these blown glass forms are suspended from the ceiling. They're large and they get suspended almost like a chandelier from the ceiling. In cases like that, the center of gravity really actually doesn't play a terribly important role. What's important is that you have a mass hanging from some sort of support, and that support that the artist provides or that may have been chosen in the past may be woefully too weak. And you have a lot of choices of really high strength, relatively thin cable that you can use. And in the past, there have been some examples where there would be a historic chandelier, or in Istanbul, there are a number of mosque lamps, for example, that they want to display hanging. It's very important that they're hanging. And in that case, a thin but very high strength cable was strung up inside of the traditional chain that supported the lamp. So you had a backup system that was incredibly strong, that wouldn't fatigue or break. Then the second most important, or equally important, are the connections at the ceiling or wherever it's hanging from, and the connections to the object. Those have to be strong enough to include probably a 3 or 4 times safety factor. So if the object weighs, let's say, 50 kilos or 100 kilos, then the strength of the connection has to be at least 3 or 4 times that. So you're pretending that you're hanging a 400 kilo object instead of 100. All of that is because 2 things happen in the earthquake. One, as Max said, it swings back and forth, perhaps for 2.5, 3 minutes, right? It'll swing back and forth. And you don't want any fatigue in those joints to weaken them and then they fail. And secondly, remember we talked about vertical. That's true of hanging objects as well. The ceiling to which this object is connected goes up and then suddenly comes down, right? And so it's like yanking dynamically on that chain or yanking on that cable. And that's why you include these big safety factors, because dynamically or at rest, the force on the support chain or wire is whatever the weight of the object is, 1 gravity, right? So if it's 100 kilos, then it's 100 kilo of force acting on that chain. If, however, you suddenly yank on the chain, as any dog will tell you, right, the forces go way up and you can suddenly have a force of 4 or 5 times that. So you want those connections and that cable to withstand. You always want to use as strong a material as you can.
Thank you, Jerry. I would now like to encourage our participants to continue asking questions, but I would also like to use this opportunity to invite some of the colleagues from the museums in Zagreb to share some of their experiences, and not just experiences, but observations they made regarding what happened to their to the objects from their collections and also to the exhibition or storage furniture. So I know that we have among our participants one colleague from the Archaeological Museum in Zagreb, Jacqueline Balen. And Jacqueline, if you are able to turn on and willing to turn on your camera and microphone, I was wondering if you would like to share with us some of your experiences, if you managed after the earthquake, when you did a survey of the situation, did you manage to get some conclusions regarding what was good or bad in the way the objects were exhibited or stored, what happened to the exhibition or storage furniture? And if you can shed some light on that, and also tell us a little bit about where your museum is at this moment, what you are working on, and if you are planning to introduce some improvements in your exhibition areas, etc. So over to you, Jacqueline.
Yes, thank you, Sargita. So really, thank you for organizing this workshop, and thanks to Jerry and Mac. It was really interesting listening for all of those 3 days. And I can really conclude that we did everything wrong because we were really not thinking about possibilities of earthquake will ever happened, which is very sad, because we are living in a zone which is common. So when we were making our permanent expositions, we were not thinking about, definitely, and most of our objects which were destroying during the earthquake were in our permanent exhibition. For example, I'm the head of the prehistoric department, and in our permanent exhibition, we had lots of glass shelves. And most of them were broken, and on most of them there were vessel pots, so they were also broken. So really, at my point of view, I will never use them again. So definitely a lot of things were broken because they were on the glass shelves and they were not fixed. We had some double sticks, but we heard also today, and I can also say that it was not secure for the object. The funny thing, it's funny now, but it was not funny, because the Archaeological Museum in Zagreb is placed in the center of town. The tram passed very near, and before the earthquake, we often have some vibration on our permanent exhibition, and those shelves were moving. So from time to time, we were going there and place them on the right spot again. But really, it really didn't occur to us that we should do something else about it. So this was definitely the problem. You also, Jerry put lots of photos from the Archaeological Museum in Zagreb yesterday and the day before. So lots of broken vessel, so that there were some of them, like Greek vessels, were put all together without any fixation, so they're also fell apart. And that also happened with our big, huge stone monument. The good thing was that in our storage rooms, everything went well. We had some broken artifacts, like 4 or 5 vessels, but it was really our fault because we left the doors open. We have those primate shelves, so they were not closed enough. So some of the curators forget to close them. So for now, from that point of view till now, I'm always looking if they're closed. So probably, I hope it will never happen again. But when we are speaking about documentation of what we do after the earthquake, we really did everything right, and we make the good documentation, and we photographed everything. And firstly, we removed the object which were like the crown jewels of the Archaeological Museum in Zagreb, because it is good thing that we had a categorization of all of the objects of the Archaeological Museum in Zagreb, like A, B, C, and D category. And so mostly in our permanent expositions, most of the objects are A or B. But we really, because my colleague, which is head of the Greek and Roman department, and me, I think came first in the museum, and really after he was photographing, and I was just taking out all those crown jewels if I could get to them. So really we did it good. And last thing, we left all of the broken objects, and after everything passed, together with our restoration department, we make very good documentation. So for this I think we did good. And we also I think Vlatko Čakšeran from the Sisak Museum, he spoke yesterday, and he also told that we gave him some good advices how to make documentation and what to do, but after the earthquake. Now the plan is for our prehistoric permanent exhibition that we will make the new one, everything new. First thing, I'm thinking to put less material. So we really had a lot of material, so we want to see everything has to be shown. So we will put less material. And really, we will not use glass shelves, and we will not just curator and designer will be involved. We will involve really our restoration department and really think about how to manage with the materials. So this is really, really wonderful because we are hearing this. Unfortunately, we didn't hear it earlier, but so that's life. So we won't make the same mistake again, definitely. And thank you for have the opportunity to say that loud.
Thank you so much for your very honest and open and contribution. It's everybody can learn a lot from your experience. And I would also like to say, I think that Jacqueline participated in earthquake salvage operations in Sisak Petrinja area. Right? Am I right? After that second earthquake struck Croatia last year, you were involved in salvage of objects from other institutions. You were helping out.
Yes, it was really bad what happened to all of us. Definitely, I really hope that it never happened again. But really, if we have to learn from our mistakes. So it was, I think I should do that if I could help with words or with hands. So I think it was my job. And I'm really hope that really it will never happen again. But for now on, no glass shelves from the prehistoric department, definitely.
But it's also good to know that we have now colleagues with very valuable experience, and if things go wrong, or if we want to plan to prepare for some worst case scenarios, that we know who we can rely on and ask for advice. So thank you very, very much for sharing this. And I would also now like to use the opportunity to invite a colleague that we heard yesterday, Anna Stolar from the Museum of Arts and Crafts. Anna, maybe if you could also say something like Jacqueline did about her experience or the experience of her institution, if you can provide some insight into the situation at the Museum of Arts and Crafts, because your museum is one of the museums that has been emptied out and awaits now thorough reconstruction. So if you can just tell us a bit more about that and about the plans for the future, but also what the consequences of the earthquake were, how the furniture behaved, what happened to the objects.
Okay, so I wrote a little cheat sheet to kind of not forget things, and I realized that we've actually done quite a bit. you know, in the span of a year and a half, you know, in the day-to-day thing, you might not experience is that something that happens immediately, but a lot has happened. So I'll do it as concise as possible so everybody else can participate as well. In the first days, what we did is that first we allowed professionals to secure the building and to secure the areas that were the hardest to reach. After that, we documented whatever I got in prior to that, but I'm not supposed to say that. I'm joking. And after that, we documented everything in situ, created extensive photographic documentation done by several different people, which allowed for several different perspectives as well, which was quite useful in creating the documentation later. We've collected the objects that were most endangered, and we collected the ones that were broken. We cleared out the rubble and we did kind of damage assessment and realized that we have to act immediately. Sorry? Oh, okay. Anyways, so we assessed the building and we had professionals come in, like statics professionals and construction engineers, assess the building and tell us which parts of the buildings were fine, which were not so fine. I'm sorry. And we basically reorganized within the house in the shortest amount of time possible for all of us to be able to work. Mind you, 3 days prior to the earthquake, we entered a general lockdown in the country. So nobody was supposed to be at work. So there was a select few of us who were allowed to come to work, about 12, 15 of us who actually conducted all this. So it was a very difficult environment to work in the first place. At that point, we realized that we need to make some serious decisions right away to know in which direction we're going to go. And our director and people involved and the professionals decided that we need a total reconstruction and a total rebuilding, which opened up a lot of different for other things, including creating a completely new image of the museum and a completely new permanent exhibition, if we're going to call it like that in the end. In the first place. Our rebranding happened just a year before that, so it's actually perfect. So right now, what's going on in the museum is that we have come to about 60 to 70% evacuation. It took a long time to go through the administrative processes of getting those spaces, equipping those spaces, just with basic things like shelvings and securing those shelves, and then the grand move. So at this point, we're still in the moving process. We are trying to do everything in levels of preventive conservation that are budget permitting. So, you know, we can't buy archival boxes in the thousands because we don't have the money for it. But what we can do is buy archival material that we can line the regular boxes with, and in that way prevent contact of objects with other materials. All the objects that are unstable, like for example, the complete clocks collection, have been packed away in boxes, secured completely, but the boxes have been adjusted to long-term storage, which means that we drilled holes in them, kind of isolated them with the little textiles and things so, you know, little bugs can come in and things like that. So we thought about it on a very low budget scale. And we have moved everything over. I think it's important to state and say that while all this is happening, we are still active on the Zagreb and Croatian cultural scene with exhibitions, with events, with education, with projects, and with collaborations, because we think that it's important to stay present no matter what the adversity you face. So maybe that's why things are going also a little slowly than they would in general, but you know, we work on so many different levels and it's important to participate in the society. Last thing I would like to mention is the future plans. A few weeks ago, our director and the head of our technical services traveled to Rotterdam in the Netherlands, and they also took all the construction engineers that are involved in creating plans for future reconstructions to visit museums that have quite more advanced storage rooms, different, just advanced modern museums of the 21st century, in order to kind of broaden our knowledge and, expand the ideas of what we can do in our own city. So we're kind of going in that direction now. The conservators are collaborating with the people who are planning the reconstructions. We are delivering all our needs in terms of, let's say, climate expectations for the new storage rooms, just expectations for the new workshops. What do we expect of all the storage spaces to kind of look like? What are our needs? What are the needs of the objects? So we're all working together, and we're trying to make it as multidisciplinary as possible. Lastly, I think the issues that we are facing are resources, slow administration from the government, and in general, creation bureaucracy is quite difficult. And the last thing that I think it's important is the time since the earthquakes have happened. We tend to forget. And I think it's important to keep the impetus and keep the zealousness of our work as alive as possible. So things have to happen now, otherwise we're going to forget about them again. So that's all for me.
Thank you so much for your wonderful contribution and very wise words. Jerry and Mac, if there's something that you would wish to add, please do so. And if not, we will ask Dunja to read a few questions from the chat section. Anna, thank you so much for this and for yesterday as well.
My pleasure.
I think just a short comment. First of all, to thank both of you, as well as your other colleagues and other institutions, for sharing so transparently the documentation and your thoughts about the disastrous events. That documentation is so valuable, as I've said so many times in the last 2.5 days, of trying to figure out what we can do better and also what worked, so that we can consider replicating that. Jacqueline, I'm sorry to tell you this, but it will happen again. It may not happen in your professional career, it may not happen in your lifetime, but it will certainly happen again. There is no question. You are in a seismic zone. There was a friend of mine, actually. I was talking to them just recently about this workshop, and he knows nothing about conservation or seismic mitigation. And I said, one of the things I was so impressed with from my Croatian colleagues was their in the face of such adversity, 2 very large earthquakes close to one another and countless aftershocks and a pandemic, they had undying optimism. I mean, just wonderful optimism and commitment. And there was this sense that they were like a phoenix rising back up, right? Being reborn with that kind of optimism. And he looked at me and he said, yes, but in the workshop that you're conducting, it's like now the phoenix has a fire extinguisher. I thought that was wonderful, right? Because you're developing an awareness. It's not your fault you didn't have it before. It will be your fault if you don't do something about it now, right? And you're planning for a way of protecting your collection in the same way the phoenix might have a fire extinguisher to put out the next flame. So you have my great admiration and gratitude for sharing this. What you need to do now, I think, is make sure that you thoroughly share it with each other, that you have long discussions with each other as a community about what you're all facing and what you all want to do, because together you'll be able to come up with the best solutions for the inevitable next one.
Thank you, Jerry. It was beautiful, your comment. And I'm also thanking Jacqueline and Anna for their words. And I will read some questions from the chat. First is from Dorotea Podolshak. She says, could you fasten hanging installations on multiple points? Would that give them more stability without sacrificing mobility and intended presentation, or would you rather place them on the ground where they are far more stable?
Mac, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think anytime you can help stabilize an object from multiple locations, you're going to be better off. As Jerry mentioned previously, there are circumstances where you are required to suspend objects, and you have to come up with solutions for that. One of the methods we have used in the past is to suspend the object off of a backboard. So oftentimes in the back of a case, you have a rigid board that acts as a wall surface, and you can make a mount that comes off and holds the suspension aspect of the object. And then underneath at the bottom, you can also provide a shelf, sometimes very discreetly, that isn't very visible. So you can provide the appearance of suspension, but also provide strategic points of support at the top, at the bottom, and perhaps even in the middle. It helps when you're suspending that object from a backboard, where you can fasten your hardware behind the object. It's not so visible, and you can bring hardware out from that backboard to the object itself and preserve the image of it being suspended.
Yeah, I think often of a couple of mounts that you made of a small suspended glass, I believe, a little lamp. It wasn't very large, and it had a preserved ancient chain and everything. And the curator and designer wanted to show that it was a suspended object, and you were able to bring a very discreet, very thin mount out from the backboard that held the top of the chain. And then lower down in the body of the lamp, you were able to also bring out a mount that was very discreet and hidden that suspended the body of the lamp. So it looked, for all intents and purposes, that the lamp was hanging in midair, but in fact it was completely supported, and the chain was there was no force on the chain at all, and there was no way for that lamp to swing around or move. Now, the larger the object gets, of course, that becomes more difficult. And then if you have like a historic period room and you're trying to exhibit a chandelier in the middle of the room, as Max said, in that situation, you really have no other choice except to strengthen the connection, make sure that if it's hanging 6 feet, make sure that in a radius of 6 feet, there's nothing that it can collide into.
Thank you, Jerry. We have another question from Veljko. It is there a way of securing paintings hung on the wall from falling during an earthquake? Does it even happen often during earthquakes?
Yes, it happens quite often. Paintings fall because of corroded hardware or insufficient strength of the hardware, or they swing outward and slam against the wall numerous times, weakening the frame, causing distortion of the stretcher bars and then damage to the painting, or they swing sideways in plane and they collide with the other paintings, causing again damage, predominantly to the frame, but sometimes to the painting itself. In storeroom, it's notorious that there's these racks that people hang the paintings on that pull out and then go back in together. The racks start moving, the paintings start colliding with one another, they fall off, they get torn. So yes, there are ways of doing that. Mac, you would take that?
I think you mentioned yesterday there's hardware that is available off the shelf in some locations where you have a discrete clip underneath the frame of the paintings that interlocks with an element that's fastened to the wall. So this would prevent the painting from swinging out, and also, as Jerry mentioned, it would prevent the painting from going side to side. That's usually installed with a provision at the top to do something similar. So I know many paintings are hung on a wire on the back side of the painting, and if the hardware is stable enough, adding that clip to the bottom can really help keep the painting against the wall. It doesn't prevent movement of the canvas, which is another troubling aspect to earthquakes that we've only started to approach with simulating that on shake tables and such. Is even if you do fasten the frame of the painting to the wall so that it can't swing out or side to side, the canvas itself, being flexible, has a tendency to vibrate. Naturally, that's destructive to the pigment on the canvas, and I have no solution to prevent that yet. Typical framing methods don't take that into account, but preventing movement of the frame itself with physical restraints will go a long way towards preserving any painting.
This gives me a little bit of an opportunity to remind you that we've said many times that the motion, the ground motion, and the motion of the building, and therefore the motion of the objects, has an infinite choice as to the number of directions it will move. We were reviewing display conditions at a museum outside the United States, and there were a collection of these tall tripods with large vases at the top. And we were told that they were seismically restrained, and so we're sort of curious about that. And a lot of museums have heard about the use of monofilament to tie things down. Essentially, it's fishing line, right? That you tie it down, maybe drape it over the object, tie it to the object, tie it to the deck of the base. Well, the way in which these were restrained was this tall, thin tripod or stand with this big object, and they had tied monofilament toward the top, one strand, and brought it back to the back of the case, right? Now, if the earthquake was only going to move front to back, that might have been somewhat effective. But we don't know how the earthquake's going to move. It could move in any given direction, particularly side to side. And with only one strand of monofilament holding it back, I think the comment, I apologize because it sort of seemed like I was being rude, but I think my comment was, this is like a small chihuahua on a leash, right? If the chihuahua runs forward, you can constrain it, but if it runs to the side, it's completely unrestrained. So thinking about all these directions when you're planning a mount is really important. And that came to mind when the question came up of, if I restrain it from different directions, will it help? Yes, if you can do that.
Thank you both. I would like to ask Maya Kocian from the Museum Documentation Center to ask her question in person.
I'm coming out of darkness again because of my camera that decided to die. So sorry. The question is connected to what we saw yesterday. Jerry showed us some of the photos from the Croatian National History Museum. Our National History Museum had in their permanent collection some of the museum exhibition cases were historic cases. And you remember, Jerry, you pointed out how all that glass fell and did huge damage. So the question is, what about if they want to keep some of those historic cases? Is there a way to retrofit it in a way to make them safe? Like, is there a way to use plexiglass or something so that, you know, because those cases are part of the history of the museum. So I was wondering, once we realized that glass is no go, have you ever had such a example?
Mac?
I have not had an example, but I do appreciate the value of the historic cases. I've been to many museums that still have the old wooden cases with the glass shelves. And there's a certain aesthetic there that is of value. If the choice is made to try and retrofit, as you say, and reuse these cases, as you point out, plexiglass, acrylic sheet can replace glass shelves. As Jerry mentioned yesterday, if you're going to retrofit in that manner, you do need to rigidly attach those plexiglass shelves to the case itself so that they can't move around. They should not be suspended. They should be rigidly attached. And they also will provide you the ability to drill through them for hardware to fix the objects down. So I think if retrofitting is the direction that has been chosen, that your idea of replacing the glass with plexiglass acrylic sheet is a good one, as long as it's stabilized inside the case.
And stabilizing might also include, depending on the size of the shelf, the surface area of the shelf, it might also include some thin under the shelf support, metal support, metal bars that come across the bottom, because plexiglass over time, especially underweight, can sag. So you want to be careful that you pick an appropriate thickness and that you provide some underneath support, which, you know, doesn't have to be intrusive at all. It can be a very thin diameter stock of metal bar, and then perhaps a frame around the plexiglass that is anchored into the case, as Mac was suggesting.
Yeah, but you know, for their collection of butterflies and mosquitoes, that would be enough with plexi.
True. You just want to check with the plexiglass vendor that you say, well, I have it this length and this width and this thickness. Even if I don't have any load or any significant load on it, over time, do you think it will sag or do you think it will deform? Just check with them. Yeah.
Thank you, Jerry.
Probably also, if I could add, traditionally, the cases that I'm reflecting on that I've seen in older museums, it's oftentimes the case that these structures are not attached to the walls or they're not attached to the floors. They're just freestanding. And naturally, based on the photographs we've seen, as well as our practical experience, during retrofitting, it should be discussed that these caseworks have to be restrained themselves. Not only the objects inside and the elements inside, such as shelving or blocks that something might be stacked upon, everything has to be physically restrained.
Yeah, we are lovers of freestanding objects in our country.
Yeah.
I'll tell you an anecdote. When I became the director of the Museum Documentation Center, our library that is situated in the longest corridor in our office, and that houses about 50,000-60,000 books, not a single shelf was fixed to the wall. So when I asked my guys to do it, and I told them we should do it because in case of earthquake, these shelves are going to fall down and you will all be stuck behind in your rooms. They looked at me as if I was Green Man or Moon Man, but thank God I'm old enough to remember Banja Luka and Dubrovnik and Montenegro earthquakes. So I thought I had this picture of all these shelves falling and all of my people being locked in their rooms. And to tell you the truth, after the earthquake, even though some of the shelves were fixed with 10 centimeters long screws, some of them, because the shaking was so strong, some of those screws came out of the walls, but not a single shelf fell. So, lesson learned.
Yeah.
Okay, to you, Sagita, back.
No, thank you, Maya, for the great question and for tackling this very important issue. Now, over these 3 days, we've the examples that we saw and that we discussed the most were those from museum institutions, although, of course, all these things can be transferred to private collections. But I wanted to ask maybe if you have some words of advice or some tips to give for the church collections or the church inventories. And the first thing that comes to my mind, any advice on what to do, for example, with wooden or wooden polychrome altars in the churches, so objects like those. Any proposals or advices on what to keep an eye on from either Jerry or Mac?
Well, I think the problem presented by churches is that often the material is really large, but the problems and the solutions are very much the same as for museums, and the concerns are very much the same. So I think I don't think I have anything that's specific to churches. I think those issues can translate quite directly. Yeah.
Thank you, Jerry, for that. Dunja, I know that, so I'm keeping an eye on our chat section. I don't see any new questions coming up, only one advice from Anna Stolar from the Museum of Arts and Crafts, who advises the colleagues who are interested in base isolators and expensive equipment in general to maybe try to reach out to university or graduate or doctoral students and their professors, because they might, that might be a direction to entertain, says Anna, and I concur with this. I know that, let me again invite all the participants. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. If not, we will then wrap it up, not just for today, but the workshop in general. I know that Dunja has a question that she's been meaning to ask, I think, since Monday. So Dunja.
Yes, thank you. I was thinking about the first day, Jerry, and you showed us a map of the United States and seismic map, of course. And you told us about Central America and how on that area of the US earthquakes weren't that, they aren't as many as in the California. And I was wondering, do the museums in that area need to be prepared for earthquake? Because I was thinking about Croatia, and Croatia is a small country. And when Petrinja earthquake appeared, we felt it all over the place, not only on the Adriatic side, but on the continent, on the Far East. So I know, for example, in my hometown, Slavonski Brod, which is 150 kilometers from Petrinja, it was really felt, and I've heard that it was felt in Belgrade, which is located like almost 400 kilometers from Petrinja. And I was wondering, do those places that are on the seismic map, green or yellow maybe, do they need to think about earthquakes?
Before I answer that, let me just say that it's important for all cultural institutions to take a look at seismic hazard maps. Not a few years ago, there was that big earthquake that affected the Smithsonian institutions in Washington, even though the earthquake was quite some distance away. And the publication that they came out with after that, which was an admirable publication, but it had the ironic title of The Unexpected Earthquake. And my point is that if you are looking at the hazards that you face, one of those hazards that you should look at is earthquakes. You may be pleasantly surprised from the hazard maps that you're in a green zone. But if my colleagues in Washington would have looked at the hazard maps, they would have realized they were well within a seismic zone, albeit they happen very rarely, but they happen. And voila, it happened quite strongly, and there was a considerable amount of damage to architecture and collections. So those people that are in the green zone, you know, every time there's an upgrade of the seismic hazard maps, it's always bad news. They always find more faults. They extend the areas, they change the colors to getting warmer and warmer as they realize statistically how bad the situation can be. Those areas in the green zones are rarely prepared, and the structures are, the codes for building are rarely up to sufficient strength to withstand earthquakes. So a smaller earthquake or a smaller, the receiving of a smaller amount of earthquake energy can do much more damage. Now, if you're in Nebraska or Iowa, right in the middle of the United States, where it's you know, seismic hazard map is about as green as it can be, there are two considerations. One is that you probably don't have to do as much, but you should be aware that there might be some shaking at some point from an earthquake far away, as Donia, you mentioned, or that you might notice that as you fly across the state of Nebraska, that there are these funny circles, not the crops, but lighter colored earth in kind of circles. Those are evidence of ancient sand spouts from ancient mega earthquakes. So you're not completely free of the hazard. It's just a very small chance. So all I advise is that you be aware of the possibilities in your location and around your location. And maybe you only have to do a small amount of mitigation, but you should at least take it into consideration.
For example, at least fix the shelves.
Well, fix the shelves, yes, fix the shelves, put the heavy thing on the bottom, you know, you probably don't have to do as much as if you were near an active fault. But, you know, if you take that advice seriously and you fix a pedestal so that it's not wobbling every time you walk by it, isn't that a good thing anyway? Because as the visitors come through and school group comes through and bumps against it and it falls over, I mean, it won't if you've taken that precaution.
Yes, I also need to say that in my hometown there was an earthquake in 1964, 5.6 over the Richter scale, and it was devastating. I remember my father telling me he was a small child then, and they were going to school in tents because buildings were collapsed. Like almost 3,000 buildings were completely collapsed, and 8,000 were extremely damaged. So even though it's a yellow greenish area.
Exactly. You must learn from the past.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you both, Jared. Those words are sound wonderful, and that's a great message. I think that we are reaching slowly the end of our workshop, and so there are no new questions in chat. So what I would like to do now is to ask maybe Mac, you can go first, and then Jerry, some final thoughts, to sum up what we have gone through over these past 3 days. So Mac, you go first, and then I will hand it over to Jerry.
Well, I must say, I'm sure Jerry's as impressed as I am with the amount of effort and the optimism that he spoke of earlier is evident in everybody's face. It's wonderful to see you all so curious and interested in coming up with solutions for this problem that, as Jerry mentioned, will not go away. There was a publication put out by the Getty Conservation Institute many, many years ago called Between Two Earthquakes. We are always between two earthquakes, and it's a good thing to keep in mind that the next one is coming. We don't know when, but it certainly will. One thing that I'd like to plug, if I can, is the Mount Making Forum one more time. it is a voluntary effort, and it's dependent on the participation of as many people as possible. And the more people that participate, the more everybody learns, that everybody has something to contribute. And I know Jerry and I are constantly trying to learn more ourselves. Even though people might refer to us as experts, there's always more to learn. That even though the Getty is hosting next year's event, which I think comes 12 years or so after the first, we will always need more people to host these events. So while I have all of you museum professionals here, I might encourage you to consider hosting one of these mount making forums yourself. We try to encourage people to host these events in an international setting so that we can bring this knowledge more around the globe. And the more people we have who are willing to host these events internationally, the better we're able to grow our base of participants as well as our knowledge. So at every forum, we usually put out an announcement that we're looking for volunteers who are interested in hosting the next event, which will be 2 years after. So while I have you all here, I would encourage you strongly to try and support this if you possibly can. You certainly have the experience and the resources and the knowledge now to contribute greatly to that. And I hope you do keep an eye on the website and try your best to find some representative of your institutions to participate in the forums, even if it's just remotely, and then they can report back to those who weren't able to attend. Thank you. Thank you very much for your kind support and your attention.
Thank you, Mac. Over to you, Jerry, now.
I can only just fully and wholeheartedly support everything Mac said. Do look at the Mount Making Forum, and absolutely the optimism that you show in the face of such adversity is encouraging and impressive. And your transparency is especially impressive, given that that has always been one of the largest barriers to progress in this area. I would only add to all the things that were said, wouldn't it be wonderful if there was a place on the web, of course, where everyone could search and input all of these issues, not just the Mount Making Forum, but all of the issues. Designers, encourage engineers to come on and take a look at this strange thing called heritage preservation. And what does this mean? And oh my gosh, they've got these interesting problems. And you might find that you have a whole engineering community globally who's interested in involving themselves, at which time you can check off one of your biggest needs. And that's the expertise of the engineers and the seismologists. I've tried for years to find some place where that could sit. I think it has to sit on the web. It probably has to come from a university or a large institution. Eventually, I hope it will happen to keep support and interest alive. I know that if it has participants such as the ones, my Croatian colleagues here today participating in these 3 days, and particularly those who have organized this, I know it will be a great success. So thank you from me for this opportunity to share what is both Mac and mine passion, and be able to spread the information around and be encouraged by all of your participation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry and Mac. We are extremely grateful for you and for your time in this workshop. I would like to invite Maja Kocijan from the Museum Documentation Center to give her final thoughts.
Thank you, Dunja. At the end, I will go back to the back. I will go back to the beginning of our 3 days of this workshop. and to the expression with which I started my address to you, and that is this Historia est magistra vitae. So I would like to sum up by repeating we should learn from past, and adding we should learn from each other if we want our heritage to have any future. I also would like to repeat again, we cannot allow and we cannot afford to be surprised by any other earthquake again, because they are here to stay, and it is not question when it's question when, not if they are going to happen. Another thing which I would like to stress out, it has something to do with what Jerry was talking at the beginning. Museums are not just buildings. If we do not have funds for retrofitting buildings, and for some of these science fiction based isolations, I mean, from our point of view, it's a real science fiction. It doesn't mean that we cannot do a lot more to prevent the damage. Also, what I would like to stress is what we've learned from these 3 days. It is that we cannot do it alone, and we cannot go on using just the old methods and materials. The job cannot be done by curators and designers and museum technicians alone. We have to work together. We have to ask for help from other experts, from other people who had similar experiences. The word engineers was never ever mentioned in our museum when we were thinking about different methods of prevention. Screws, clips, museum wax are sometimes not enough. That's what we've learned. But a Zagreb earthquake has recently showed us all that if they are not used, the damage is bigger, and that's the truth. We have to learn more. We have to study things that we never ever thought of studying. The forces, how they work, we have to discuss it with our colleagues who are professionals in seismic sciences and engineering. And we have to draw our own little maps or how our particular museums and in our particular countries function and react to those forces. So there is much we can do and we should do. And at the end, I would just like to thank our lecturers. Like, I'm so sorry that I can't. I mean, I see you, but it would be much nicer if you can see me. I also want to thank Sagita and Dunja and all the participants that survived us. And I do hope that these 3 days I will have to quote Casablanca. I hope that this is just the beginning of one big, great friendship and cooperation. I had numerous ideas that came from what you were saying. I'm not going to address them now because I don't want to say hop before I jump. So you will know when the time comes for that. Thank you all so much. And I'm going back to my heart of darkness.
Thank you, Maya. Wonderful words.
Thank you, Maya, for everything that you said. I just, as we now come to the very, very end of our 3-day, very intensive program, at the end of which I can also say that we have learned a lot and we have learned how little we know. I would just like to remind everyone in the audience that this workshop was jointly organized by the Conservation Restoration Department of the Arts Academy in Split. And what you see here is our Jubilee logo, the Academy celebrating its 25th anniversary next year, and in collaboration with the Museum Documentation Center. So this is also a beginning of, I think, a very prospective collaboration that will extend to future. Thank you so much, Jerry, for so generously sharing your knowledge over these 3 days. Thank you, Mac, for joining us today and for sharing the years of your practical experience. We have really learned a lot, and we appreciate it that you have agreed to the recording of this workshop. So we know that this too, just like Mac's forum, the recordings will become a valuable learning resource, both for professionals and also for the students, conservation restoration students, museology, etc., etc. So thank you both. It was wonderful to be able to learn from you and to listen to your lectures. I would like to use this opportunity to give my thanks to all the professional organizations from Croatia, from Slovenia, from Bosnia and Herzegovina, even in the Balkan Museum Network, for supporting us in disseminating the call for participation. As you know, we received almost 200 applications. And so within this workshop, if we just talk about museum community, 60 museum institutions were represented among our participants. So it's what you have said, what we have learned, it will be disseminated, not just in Croatia, but also on a broader scale. And at the very end, of course, we would like, as organizers, we would like to hear from our participants. We would like to hear how they like the workshop, how you like the workshop. So we do invite you to please fill out the workshop evaluation form. We share the link in the chat section, but all the participants will get the link also via email. And so this is how this form, this is what you will see once you click on the link. The questions are below. I didn't want to share them right away, but the questions are both in English and in Croatian. So Croatian audience, you can write your responses in Croatian, and all the other people can do it in English. We would really appreciate to receive information, to hear what you like, what you found most interesting, and what you think that you can implement in your own institutions, in your own work. And so with this, I would like to conclude my part. Thank you all for your participation, and over to Dunja.
Sagita said it all. I'm extremely grateful to our lecturers. I'm extremely grateful for our participants and for sticking with us these 3 days. I think it was very useful, invaluable, and we will use it for sure in our next makings of permanent exhibitions and in storages and etc. And I would like to also say that recordings will be available on the YouTube channel of the Museum Documentation Center, probably this week or next, but we will send you all email about that so you don't miss it. Yeah. So we can now say goodbye and see you in another opportunity, I hope.
Bye, everyone. Bye, Jerry Mac.
Bye. Thank you.